Hello and welcome to Gardening at 58 North. So in this video I would like to show you how to force hyacinth bulbs, and that way you can get hyacinths flowering at Christmas time or any time during the winter when you don't normally have any kind of greenery or flowers in the house. So when it comes to buying the hyacinth bulbs, you want to find a decent one. Now you can buy them online or you can buy them in person in a garden centre or a shop. If you can buy them in person, that's probably the best option, because then you can check the bulbs, make sure they're actually decent quality bulbs. If you buy them online, you don't really know what you're getting until they arrive, and so you just have to use what you get. So these 4 bulbs were actually bought online, so I can show you there's a bit of variance between them. What you are looking for is a bulb similar to this. So what you're looking for is very little growth out the top. You don't want to have much more than this. Even this is actually a bit more growth than what you're looking for. What you ideally have is something like this or smaller. But you want to make sure the top isn't shriveled and dead. You also want to make sure the bulb is nice and firm. Ideally it will have this kind of papery material around the whole side of it. It doesn't matter too much if it hasn't and it's just got this white, but as long as it's firm and it feels like quite a heavy bulb and no part of it is soft, that's good. And you also want to avoid any that has a lot of mould around the base. A small amount of mould isn't a problem, but if there's a lot, that could be a slight issue. And you're also making sure that the base isn't particularly damaged and there's no sections where it's seeping any fluid or anything like that. Now this is an example of a low quality bulb. This one, as you can see, is very dry at the top. The bottom has a few sections which are showing a little bit of mould starting to appear, and it actually feels a little bit soft as well. So this is a poor quality bulb. If you're looking for bulbs, don't try and get any like this. Try and get the firm ones with just a tiny bit of green at the top. I will be planting this anyway because there's a chance that it might grow, but if it does flower, it won't flower as well as the other ones, and in fact it might actually just die. So when it comes to buying the hyacinth bulbs, you've got 2 options really. You've got pre-treated bulbs, or you've got just standard bulbs. The pre-treated ones, they're the best to go for if you're wanting to grow them in the house over winter time. They've had a cold chilling period already, so when it comes to planting, the cold chilling period that you need to do at home will be much shorter, just probably about a month or so. Whereas if you get ones that aren't pre-treated, you might have to chill them for about three months in total. So there's quite a big difference with that. So if you're growing it inside as a forcing bulb, try and get ones that are pre-treated. So you'll also want to wear gloves when handling these bulbs. These bulbs are a little bit toxic, and for some individuals they can cause an allergic reaction to the skin. So when you're handling them, make sure you do wear gloves all the time. So when it comes to container choice and compost, it's not too critical with these bulbs. It depends how you're going to treat them afterwards. So a lot of people use these bulbs as a disposable flower, such as like a cut flower or bouquet. Once you've grown them, you've had the flower, you just throw them out. If you're doing that, it really doesn't matter too much about your pot size or depth, as long as it's probably about twice as deep as the bulb ideally, and it has the ability to be free draining as well, so it doesn't get waterlogged. Now it doesn't have to be free draining. I'm not planting mine in a free draining dish, but I'll just have to be really careful with the watering when it comes to watering to make sure it doesn't get overly saturated and the roots start to rot. And now if you are wanting to grow this year after year, so you want to save the bulbs, maybe put them in the garden or use them again next year, you want to get a much bigger bulb container. You want to get a container that's probably 3 or 4 times deeper than the bulb. That way there's plenty of space for the roots. The plant will do better and it will be able to gather enough resources and nutrients for next year, because all the energy and nutrients needed for the flowering is actually already in the bulb. So that's why it's not too critical if you're just wanting that 1-year flowering display. But going forward into next year, once it's finished flowering, it then uses the sunlight and the nutrients from the compost to build up its energy reserves again and form a new flower for next year inside the bulb. So that's why if you're growing it for year after year, it needs to have plenty of root space and a good quality compost. But if you're not growing it year after year, then compost wise, you can just go with something like bulb fibre, which is like a no nutrients, water absorbent material, which is specifically suited for bulbs. But you can really go with any compost. I tend to use multi-purpose compost because it has a little bit of feed in it. That helps it because I often plant mine in the garden the next year. But as I say, it doesn't matter too much if you are planning to bin them, as long as it holds moisture but it doesn't get completely sodden wet, then that should work fine. And also make sure the compost doesn't have any very hard lumps in it, so break up any hard lumps that you find. The roots are quite weak on hyacinth bulbs and they'll struggle to push through a really compacted soil, so make sure the soil is nice and loosened before you actually start using it. So I'm going to plant this up now. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to check the depth of the container, make sure it's about right, see what depth I want to put the bulb. Mine's just about twice as deep as the bulbs are tall. And when it comes to planting hyacinth bulbs, if you're planting them inside, you don't actually need to plant them too deep. If you plant them in the garden, you probably plant them 2 or 3 times the depth of the bulb. But indoors, with a sheltered environment, it doesn't matter too much about planting depth, as long as they're planted deep enough to be stable. So I'm just going to start filling this up with a thin layer of compost in the bottom. As I said before, I'm just using multi-purpose compost. I've just made sure it's well broken apart so that it's nice and loose and it's not compacted. It shouldn't inhibit any other root growth. So I'm just going to fill the bottom of the container with a nice layer of compost. And then I'm just going to periodically check, see what the height's like, see if I need to go higher or lower. So that's just about right actually. So what I'm going to do now is place my bulbs on the surface. Normally when it comes to round containers, I normally recommend going with odd numbers. It just seems to fit better with the containers. This one's a bit of a dodgy bulb. I'm going to plant it anyway, but generally it looks nicer if you have a nice odd number like that. I just find that if it's a square container, even numbers might look better. I find odd numbers of bulbs look better in round containers. But I'm a bit sceptical as to whether this bulb will flower at all. So you don't want to cover them too deep. And when you're covering them up, make sure if you are using a trowel or something, that you don't damage that shoot at the top. The most important parts of the bulb are the very base where the roots come out from, and also the top of the bulb. So you just want to be careful not to damage any new shoots that are starting to come out. So when it comes to how deep you want to bury the bulb, it really helps with stability. You can actually have it so it's only a very thin layer of compost in the bottom, but it will fall over and you'll have problems in the future. So what I like to do is just cover the bulbs. Anything over halfway is good, but ideally if you cover it just up to the neck of the bulb, that will be better. And if you have a very deep container, or if they're going to be going outside in a slightly windier location, then you can actually bury the bulbs completely and just cover them in soil. So I also like to give it a little shake sometimes just to make sure that the compost is settled around it. And now at this stage what I'll be doing is I'll be putting it into its cold period to induce it into flowering. So when it comes to hyacinths, these are spring flowering bulbs. What happens in the wild is they're dormant over summer, the warm temperatures keep them dormant, then coming into winter they can detect the lower temperatures, they start growing their roots during the colder months, they then sit there waiting until the warmer months, but the roots will be fully developed. And then as soon as the warmth comes, the roots are already developed, so they can straight away start growing the top half and flowering and making the most of the warm weather at the very earliest time in spring. So what you need to do is trick the bulbs into thinking they're coming into autumn and winter time. So the way to do that is to keep them cold and damp and in a dark location. Now light levels, it doesn't matter too much unless you're doing them in a vase. I would just give these either no light or just a small amount of light. You don't want them in hot sunshine or anything like that. And what you want to do is, the main thing is the temperature. So if you're in a warm country, or if you're trying to get them to flower for Christmas and you don't have a lot of months of cold between summer and Christmas time, you probably want to put this in a fridge. So the ideal temperature for this is between 5 and 10 degrees, which is 41 to 50 Fahrenheit. Now you can go as low as 0 degrees, that's not a problem, but it will just take a bit longer for the process to work. Basically the roots will grow slower if it's really cold temperatures, but you want anything below 10 degrees. Above 10 degrees is too warm, and what will happen is you'll get shoot growth. So the colder the temperature, the less that the shoot will grow and the more that the roots will grow, until about 5 degrees. Any lower than 5 degrees, then the whole process tends to slow down a little bit. You don't want to go to freezing because there is a chance you might damage the bulbs, so try and keep it above freezing, but close to freezing is not a problem. The longer the cold period, the better, because that allows its roots to get really well established. If you don't have enough established roots, what happens is it has very weak growth when it starts to warm up again, and what that tends to cause is very stunted flowers. You'll find the flowers only just come up maybe a few centimeters or an inch or two above the soil, and they open and they don't fully develop, and even the leaves don't fully come out. So if that happens, that means you haven't given it a long enough cold period, so the roots aren't big enough, they're not well enough developed. So it's very important to give it plenty of time. If they are pre-treated bulbs, you might be okay with just as little as a month. If they're not pre-treated, longer the better. Try and give them 2 or 3 months if you can. But if you do less, it's not the end of the world. You'll just have slightly shorter flowers and a bit more stunted. But always give them at least a month if you can. If you do less than a month, you'll get very stunted flowers and they really won't look well. So when they're in that cold spell, as I say, you want to keep them steadily cold. If they have any particular warm periods of time, they're going to suffer. You can put them in the fridge. What I'm going to do is, I have a cold conservatory, which is normally between about 7 and 10 degrees, so that's where I'll be putting mine for the next month or so. These are pre-prepared bulbs, so they should only need about a month of treatment, but I'll probably give them just a little bit extra just to make sure the roots are well established. And what you're waiting for is you're waiting for these shoots to get slightly larger, so you shouldn't wait until they're probably about an inch or two in size, and you want to make sure that they're nice healthy looking shoots. If they're starting to shoot up much faster, then you've probably got it too warm, or they're ready to be taken into the warmth and ready to flower. If there's very little growth after a month or two, they just seem to be sitting there doing nothing, it's probably too cold, so just give them a slightly warmer temperature and they should start to kick them into growth. And then once they're about an inch or two in size, that should be a good indication that the roots are well established. You can then bring them into the warmer temperatures. Now ideally about 15 degrees Celsius, but most houses aren't that cold. So just anywhere that's quite cool, 20 degrees is fine. You don't really want to go over 20 degrees. So I'll see you now in a few months' time when they're just starting to come up, and I'll talk about what kind of conditions they need now that they're just starting to come back into growth. So it's now about 2 months later, and this is what your plants should look like once they're ready to come inside into a warmer position and be encouraged into flowering. So you're looking at growth of around about 2 inches in height. Now you might also be able to see a lot of the flower buds coming up. You can certainly see it on some of these. Don't worry too much if you can't see the flower buds and it's just a load of leaves. The flowers should come up later. With different bulbs at different temperatures, sometimes the flowers come up at slightly different stages. So sometimes you have lots of leaves like this and no real sign of flowers, or you'll have other ones like the ones at the back here where there's lots of flowers coming up and the leaves aren't quite as prominent. So now you want to be quite careful when it comes to introducing them to warmer temperatures. You also need to introduce them to stronger light levels as well. If your plants are already green, such as mine here, then you don't have to be too cautious. You just need to make sure the plant is brought to a bright location away from any direct sunlight. Now if your plants are completely yellow because they've been in the dark, then you'll need to very carefully, slowly adjust them to stronger light levels, because if they're yellow it means there's no chlorophyll, they're not used to any light, and any light will be actually quite damaging to them if it's too strong. So you just want to slowly introduce them to brighter light levels, and then eventually into bright indirect light, and then you should notice they green up within a few days. You want to bring them to a warmer temperature. If I was to bring this straight into 25 degrees Celsius, it would probably start flowering before the flowers have fully emerged, and then you'd get a stunted bloom. So you want to be bringing it into a room which is around 15 degrees Celsius. This will give you the right amount of elongation on the flower stem and encourage the flowers to open naturally without them opening too quickly. It might be difficult to find a location in the house which is 15 degrees, but if you can keep it the closest to that as possible. 20 is a bit warm, but you can often get away with it if you've got really good, well established root system. But if you can, keep it around the 15 degree mark. And you should notice it just should grow quite rapidly. These bulbs, they're used to cool temperatures. As soon as you get a little bit of warmth, they'll think it's springtime and they'll rapidly start to grow. So you want to keep, as I say, bright indirect sunlight. If the light is too strong, what tends to happen is that growth will get a little bit stunted and the flower stem won't emerge quite as much. If it's too little sunlight, what you'll find is the flower stems will get really long and the leaves will get really long and they'll flop over and they'll need support, otherwise they might start to snap off. So you just want to find a balance, but normally bright indirect sunshine or sunshine first thing in the morning, last thing in the evening should work quite well. Once the flowers start to colour up and open, then you can just move them to any position in your house to enjoy them for a few weeks. But the cooler you can keep the temperatures, the longer they will last. If you can keep the temperatures as low as 5 degrees once they start flowering, they should last for a month or two. But in all reality that's quite difficult in a household environment, so most people will probably have them at around 20 degrees and they should last a couple of weeks in those temperatures. The higher the temperature, the shorter the blooming time, and the lower the temperature, the longer you should be able to get blooming. So that's just about it for this video. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to put these under a time-lapse camera and I'm going to show you how they develop over time. So I'll leave you with a time-lapse footage of how these come into growth over the next few weeks. And if you're wondering what to do once your blooms have finished flowering, I've made a whole video about that. I'll put a link in at the end of the video and also a link on the iCard so you can find out what to do with your hyacinths once they've finished flowering.